Our next featured speaker, Thomas Mullikin, is a research professor who teaches coastal and wetland policy and management in the School of Coastal Environment at CCU. He also serves as an associate professor at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito, where he teaches about climate change annually at their Galápagos Islands campus. Mulliken has been invited to lecture on climate change at respected universities, including the University of Edinburgh and Oxford, among others. He currently serves as the chair of the South Carolina Floodwater Commission. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Mullikin.
I think I'm going to stay down here. Good morning, everyone. Jimmy, thank you for that jolt of adrenaline this morning. And Rob, I'd love to get a copy of your slides. That's good stuff. Rob and Barb and I serve on a small business incubator over in Conway, and we have a lot of wonderful conversations. I'm here today to talk about the challenge associated with floods, which is something I know that each of you is struggling with in your own way. I'd like to say I'm not Noah. I'm not Moses. I can't part the Red Sea, so I'm going to do the best I can. I think before it's over with, some of what I say you may like, some of which I say you may disagree with, but I can tell you this, there's no fresh meat here, so if you want to chew on some, just get you a little bit. Because I've done this many years. I've done this since I had hair. In fact, I used to tell people if it got any worse, I was going to pull my hair out. So here I am. We've had this conversation sort of going for 3 or 4 decades with climate. And there's been a lot of heat, but very little light shed on the subject. And the problem is this. We talk now, people say the science isn't settled on this subject. And the truth is, that is true. The political science is not settled on this subject. And the problem is that we never get to the problem. We talk about climate and we immediately rush to a governmental resolution. And we've gone through what I would call just fads. I go back all the way to 92 when following this, I had served, and I apologize to some of you who might be offended with this, I actually started with Al Gore. I'm finishing with Charles Koch. So I think I'm the only guy in the country who can say I actually have been paid by Al Gore and Charles Koch. So that gives you sort of a wide bandwidth. But in 92, the UN came together, and it talked about pulling all the countries together to have a resolution to what was at then a subject that we were largely modeling. Well, today, and I'll come back to this, we're not modeling anymore, we're marking. We're marking, and if you live along the coast, you know what I'm talking about. Like this is no longer an esoteric conversation. So in 92, we created the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there was a great deal of conversation about that. And then the UN came back in 97, and this is where we immediately got off track. And my friends further to the left embraced this failed solution then and have all run from it now. Now, I was standing alone then when I said with the Kyoto Protocol that was framed in 1997, the UN went to Kyoto, Japan, and framed this convention that then talked about dividing the world up into 2 different sets of countries. And you read about this if you followed it then. We're going to have one standard for the developed nations and one standard for the developing nations. And you always read about it in the popular media as those developing nations, the poor folks in Ethiopia or Namibia or Micronesia. But you never read that in those countries that were written out of reduction criteria included China, the #1 emitter, now by twice, India, Brazil. And at the time that convention was framed, 48% of the world's emissions were written out of reduction criteria. And they were able to talk about that as if that was going to create a global resolution. And it just hadn't worked out very well. In fact, for those of you who are my generation, you may remember that game Whack-A-Mole. You whack it here and it comes up over here higher. That's exactly what's happened. We have simply seen since 97 and all these iterations since then, we're moving emissions from developed nations to developing nations. And when we do that, we not only are moving the jobs that are associated, and I'll come back with that, but we're also increasing listed pollutants. Another little known fact that you don't read about in the paper is that when we talk about mercury, now most of us grew up with our mom saying, don't break that thermometer, that stuff will kill you. And she was right. Mercury it's a bad actor. The highest emitter of ambient mercury today in this country is China. The highest emitter of particulate matter smog indicator in the West Coast is China. Of sulfates in the western states is China. So I'm glad you're sitting down because I'm going to start at a higher level and then I'll move all the way to Horry County. But this one is going to knock you down. We only have one atmosphere. We only have one atmosphere. And I'll promise you, I've spoken to a lot of people. The last major conference I spoke to was up in Minnesota, where I was invited up to talk about climate. And if you go up into northern Minnesota, like where my family's from, along the coastline of North and South Carolina, they called us rednecks. Up in northern Minnesota, because that's where the iron tagonite range are, the ranges are, they call the working class rangers. And so I go into this room and it's kind of like this, except half the room was Chamber of Commerce and rangers, and the other half it was very visual, and it always is, tie-dyed t-shirts. And I go in there under the auspices of talking about climate change. And when I got there, I realized I wasn't going to be talking about climate, I was going to be talking about opening a steel mill, because that's what they are interested in. And it turns out that the steel mill, like most, have a greenhouse gas footprint of about 5 million metric tons. But they were going to invest about $3 billion, $750 million, 300 jobs. This is how this whole conversation has taken place around the world. This is what was going to be the investment. And the folks on my left were not interested because they said that this was going to create a 5 million metric ton increase in greenhouse gases. Folks on the right were economic development. And so after about 4 hours of this 45-minute presentation, I asked the folks on the left, if we don't build this mill here, because we now are all friends. You know, I'm jacket, vest. By the way, this is not a vest. This is man spanks. This is for contouring. This is what my student told me. They said, Professor, that is not a vest. You're doing it for contouring. So I learn every day in my classroom. We had just taken all the way down, and I said, so what are we going to do? If it isn't built here, will it be built? And they said, well, yeah, I think it probably will be built. And I said, well, where will it be built? And they said, well, you've talked a lot about China, probably China. And then they said this. Now, these people, this is a room full of passionate, convicted, relatively smart, engaged people. And I said, well, what happens then? They said, well, at least the 5 million metric tons will not be here, it'll be there. And I was like, whoa, boy, we got a lot of work to do. And that's why I start with, we have one atmosphere. So the problem is that when we take that 5 million metric tons and we take it from the developed nations and we put it into an undeveloped nation, China in particular, it is no longer 5 million, by the way. It's 15 million, plus all the listed pollutants. So that for us to engage at a higher level on this conversation, it really is important that we start with, we have one atmosphere. And then this same group and many others that I'm invited to speak to, I say, I'm just so happy that you're passionate about greenhouse gases and you want to reduce greenhouse gases. And you fight vigorously over greenhouse gases. And we spent 4 decades talking about greenhouse gases. Which one would you like to talk about? I'm not going to call on anybody in this room because everybody starts looking down. There's 6 that the UN talk about. And I'll promise you, in 30 years of going around the world and speaking to groups, I've never, ever had anybody answer that question completely right. They don't know what the gases are. So let me give you the perspective of a redneck from Kershaw County. If you don't know what the gases are, you're going to have a heck of a time reducing them. Okay, I'm just saying. Well, most people, if you ask them, they'll tell you carbon dioxide, so I give them that. So I'm going to tell you what the 6 are right now for a reason. The 6 greenhouse gases that are listed by the UN that we are trying to reduce are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and 3 synthetic gases, fluoride gases. I'm getting some nods. I know putting my feet on the ground. Perfluorocarbon, hydrofluorocarbon, sulfur hexafluoride. So why is that important? What brings us today is to talk about climate and the resulting flooding. We have one atmosphere. Now, what is that? That is a very thin blanket around Earth. And we call it the greenhouse gases because those essentially are the fibers that make up that blanket. So when they're emitted into the atmosphere, those molecules make up the atmosphere. Now, there's others. They're just not listed, like what's the largest? Water vapor. They don't list it because it doesn't stay in the atmosphere long enough. Those 6 are the ones the UN follows. And so those are the blanket that keeps the sun's heat against the earth. And what has happened is, over time, we have seen that effect begin to impact global climatic change. Now, for those that might say climate is not changing, I'm going to do a separate breakout. The climate has always changed. Don't find yourself taking a position you can't defend. But that's typically in response to the Armageddon. And I've lived through about 3 phases of the Armageddon. When carbon concentration gets over 400 parts per million, we're going to be dead. Okay, I think we're at 416. So, I mean, those of you who are waiting on Armageddon, I'm sorry. But we've got to begin to have an informed conversation on the global level. Because what we see here in Horry County in the state of South Carolina is the recipient of things that we have had very little to do with, okay? So I'm going to give you rough numbers. And if you're taping this and you write nasty things about me on your blog, these are rough numbers, okay? Globally, we emit, man's contribution is about 45 billion metric tons. China now is at about 12 billion. The US is about 5.1 billion. South Carolina is 69 million metric tons. Now, I've had people beating up on me since we created this commission that I promise I'll talk about, because I haven't talked enough about climate. We are not even a rounding error here, but I'm going to talk about it because people push me. 69 million metric tons. We now in South Carolina have a plan to take off 4 coal-fired power plants. Is anybody in here from Sandy Cooper? No, they're in Columbia right now. We're going to take off 4 coal-fired power plants. That's just short of 12 million metric tons off the 69. This state, when that happens, will have a 17% reduction. It will be the largest reduction of any governmental unit in the world. We are going to be a global leader. The people in this community have been global leaders. We sit where the Waccamaw and Winyah tribes were. We sit in a place that was not long ago called Withers Big Swamp. We had leaders in this community who committed themselves to creating the nation's largest family vacation site in the country and one of the largest in the world. The DNA of people in this state, in this community, is meeting those great challenges. And this is a great challenge. I had just finished up doing the work on the nuclear reactors for the governor, and he called. And I'd been in the military a long time. I was way too smart to get drawn in on this. He said, Tom, I feel like we really need to do something big on this flooding. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, I feel like we need to create a commission. And that's where I went wrong. I said, yes, sir. He said, good. You're the chairman. Create it. And so I did the best I could. And so over the last year and a half, we created a commission that was going to deal with flooding. The first thing we had to do is we had to identify what is the problem. You don't have to go anywhere else in the world to be on the vanguard of what's going on with climate. In fact, I had one guy write me a very long letter. He was a senior bureaucrat who had retired, who was just absolutely disgusted that the commission should be talking about climate change and not flooding. And I was like, well, I better understand why we hadn't done anything. Because flooding is what climate looks like when it knocks on your back door. Okay, but here in South Carolina, we have 3 concurrent challenges. This is different than most anywhere in the world. We deal with extreme weather off the coast, right? We all know about that. I just retired last year as commander of the State Guard, where we were deploying people, right, Butch, down here. We've done this all over the state. And during Joaquin in 2015, it was disastrous. And since then, we have had more than $4 billion of damage to this state. Now, if a foreign enemy would have come to South Carolina, Brian, and done $4 billion, we'd be at war. And so the governor doesn't like that analogy. That's mine, by the way. So we tried to address this very aggressively. And the problem that we have is that we have all of this garbage in the public square that we can move 5 million metric tons to China and not have an impact, that kind of thing, which I think is garbage. That's fair. It's a little bit vitriolic, but it's fair. And we have all of this stuff going on at 30,000 feet, and yet we have to deal with it right here. So we have extreme weather coming off the coast. We have what academics refer to as nuisance flooding. Some people say sunny day flooding. When it rains hard, we get it, right? It's stopping traffic up and down the 187 miles from North Carolina to Georgia. We have nuisance flooding. But the other thing that we get that a lot of people don't think about is we are the welcome recipient of most of the water that gets dumped into North Carolina through extreme weather that comes up through the Gulf. So while intuitively we don't think about storms coming up through the Gulf, we get that water. And during Joaquin, the big problem we had was we invited the upstate to this conversation that we've been having in the low country for years. Came in, and then we saw dams break, and we had this cascading effect coming down through the rivers, got down to Columbia. And people have no idea how close South Carolina came to a Rita and Katrina situation when the Columbia Canal was very close to breaking. Columbia would have been underwater, and then we would have had an even greater mess. And here what we have is out of the lumber water basin in North Carolina, I saw some pictures, and I think it was a Charleston County councilman put up what had gone on in North Carolina. Well, they're not going to save South Carolina and North Carolina, and nor should we expect them to do that. I mean, I'd love for them to. But when the water comes down at the confluence of the Little PD and the Lumber River, which is what some people call Nichols, that water, it's a flooded swimming pool, and when it happens, it floods it, and it's all new water. And I say that for a reason. It's new water. It's water associated with the extreme weather systems. So we have 3 concurrent challenges, and those challenges involve the entire state. So what we did was we put together, commission had 10 task forces. And it's fascinating to me that we could write a 600-page report, and I get a call from the media saying, well, we don't like this one, but on page 423. We have to consider, and much of it is natural. Some of the resiliency strategies are man-made, but we have to be aggressive. And what I would like to challenge this group of leaders to do is help us be innovative. The last major project I did with this was in Fiji, and I happened to be down there when we were moving people off of their indigenous islands onto another island because it no longer went beyond high tide. And the places that I've been around the world that got behind this issue because they said it wasn't happening have been catastrophic. And so I go back to a comment I made earlier. It's no longer modeling, it's marking. And if there's anybody in this room who thinks all of a sudden the waters are going to recede, please give me that theory so I can sleep at night. Because I don't see it. The seas are rising at about 4 millimeters a year. I had a legislator call me a couple weeks ago and said, Tom, I just went to a conference and heard what I thought was a very credible presentation that said by the year 2050, sea level is going to rise by 20 feet. And I said, hold 1 minute, I want to have the rest of this conversation on my knees. And he said, why? I said, do you know where the coastline is if sea levels rise 20 feet? Think I-95. So today when I leave, I'm going back to my home in Camden, and I'm going to start laying out my oceanfront strategy. Seas have not risen at the level that we've marked, not modeled, that we've marked in 7,000 years. So that when we look at this, and they constantly, the vicissitudes of climate change have been throughout all of time. So I'm not here as some kind of Armageddon guy. I'm here to say, as South Carolinians, we have always met the challenge. I have friends down in Charleston that want a big seawall in front of the Charleston Harbor. I said, you got one, you call it the Battery, it's not working too well. And then I've been asked, well, let's put a seawall up. I said, well, boy, that's going to be a great idea for those behind. But those upstream and downstream, boy, it's going to be a bad day. We're not stopping the water. We've got to embrace the water. We have to learn how to solve this problem. And so I think with the people in this room, residential reservoirs, like what we have to have, and I'll give you an example of one option in a 600-page report that I tend to get beat up about. And it wasn't even from me, it was from experts I had met with. As soon as he asked me to do this, he said, Tom, they told me you will never stop the water coming out of North Carolina. You have to have a reservoir. And so now I take that and I meet, because this is a very wide band that we have. Governor didn't put numbers, so it's 82 people. And they called me and they said, people said, I want to be on the commission. And I said, well, that's good. Just bring your lunch bucket. And they thought I was kidding, so I told my son, go out to the landfill and get stuff that has been discarded, and he made 82 lunch buckets. Like the old coal miners, he doesn't ever want to make another lunch bucket. So every meeting that we had, we did something, because people are tired of planning. I had a media outfit out of North Carolina call me and say, well, you've got this, but you don't have any of this plan. I said, North Carolina is meeting in Raleigh right now. They're going to have another plan. I said, oh, that's great. What we need is another plan. That's exactly what we need. I'll tell you what, I'll send them 40 years of plans. Now, what we need now is to do, and that's what the commission has done. I'm not sure the governor liked it, but I quoted, and I wrote it down so I didn't mess it up. Leonardo da Vinci, a great polymath, right? Brilliant guy, said, I've been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. And we must do. We must do. What I was saying is that this problem is bad today, and it'll be worse tomorrow. Like, the reality of this situation is we've had people who we might call as leaders have been kicking the can down the road. And now here we are. So we've got to figure out, what are we going to do about the water? And there's a lot of opportunities for us. So we created this commission. I actually have more than one slide, but I thought you might like that one. It's a pretty picture. Do I have the thing, Barb? Is it? Yeah. So we created this commission. And the idea was to go back to let me stop right here if I could and say that we don't really give optics to the environmental problems that we have. I'm 60. When I was born, we had little more than 3 billion people on Earth. We now have 7.6 billion. And we actually have less land to put them on today. And when we talk about 7.6, this is not me casting negative dispersions on humankind, but that creates more stress on the environment. We put 8 to 10 million metric tons of plastic in the ocean every day. We have, simply by virtue of creating a middle class, created greater stress on the environment. We have issues here in South Carolina, and the governor said you got to do something about it. So we tried by putting up this floodwater commission. And we created 10 task forces, and the idea was to try to piece together everything that we could to begin to impact. And this goes from the ocean to the mountains, because it's a statewide issue. Now, there will be some that will tell you artificial reefs. There's probably scientists in this room. Artificial reefs will not stop coastal surge. And so let me tell you, if you want the report, I will bring it to your office. And here's another rule. You call me, I call you back. You call me Friday drunk, I call you back Friday drunk. Okay? I had a lady call me here very upset, said she wanted to see me. And Dave, because I come down here every week, Friday night I went to see her. She got home from the grocery store, I was sitting on her front porch, and she said, who are you? I said, I'm Tom Mullikin, you said you wanted to see me. And we sat out on her front porch and talked a long time. But the truth is, many of these people have been impacted by this. In Sellers, this is not an academic issue anymore. It's impacting people. There's a 91-year-old lady in Sellers who lost her house in Joaquin in 2015 and does not have a house in 2020. Many of the areas that have been impacted by this are some of the poorest areas of our state. Many of the areas that have been impacted by this are some of the most affluent in our state. Collectively, we've got to figure out what that resolution looks like. So we started in the ocean, artificial reefs. I spent 3 days last week up in North Carolina at an oyster reef conference. Smart river and dam security, economic development. Every year our military infuses, Rob, $24 billion into our economy. DOD was on a panel with General Counsel at DOD 2 weeks ago. They probably are the most forward-leaning because they can't have training installations that don't make it beyond an extreme weather. They have to have facilities that work all the time. We cannot have, so that's why we have the National Security Task Force listed down as about the one on the bottom. Infrastructure and shoreline armoring. A lot of people, particularly those selling that technology, believe that seawall is the only way to go. And I tell you, we put a seawall up in front of Charleston, people in Georgetown County, you think they've had it bad. They don't know what bad looks like, but it's coming. Down in Jasper County, landscape beautification and protection. We go through these. This is what we're doing now. We didn't get here overnight, and we're not getting out of here overnight. So the first thing we need to do is we need to have a greater understanding as a state what the challenge looks like and begin to create collaboration. When I say that, I go, oh yeah, collaboration. Soft and squishy. No, not soft and squishy. We've had techniques that have been available, science has been available to us for decades. We've lacked conviction to do something about it because we never agree on the problem. I told you I'd come back to that. We have people on the left that want to use this as a carbon tax. They want to use it as growing government. Early in the new millennium, they said they were not going to take gases off the list until they taxed them because that was going to pay for health care. We were going to create $1 trillion economy off of carbon tax. Today, people say, well, that's passe. That wasn't any good. But the same people who say that's passe today were vociferous for 15 years that was the only solution was to tax carbon. And so what does that mean? I just told you a large manufacturer in the state, 5 million metric tons. I'd have to look at what carbon is trading at today in London, but if I said $20 a ton, it would be somewhere in that neighborhood. This is more than walking around money. If we tax our heavy industry more, they're leaving because it's international commodities and it's international trade. And so what happens if they leave here? They go to China. And that's why China has more than doubled since Kyoto, their total footprint. So if this was easy, it would be over. And I'll promise you this issue is going to be solved in rooms like this. Because in Washington, it's about getting reelected. It's a very complicated issue. So these are the areas that we talked about. Over a year, we listened to countless testimony. We read reports. We had some of the smartest academics in the world, most of whom are right here on the faculty of Coastal Carolina as a part of that. It was not me, by the way. I'm the guy with the lunch bucket. So we looked at a number of things that we were going to do to begin to address this. All of this, again, there is no panacea. If you start with there's one atmosphere, there is no panacea. You won't stop the water. You have to embrace the water. I wish that we could create an institute here on desalinization. Like, bring us your water. In Fiji, they laughed about how much water they sell to the U.S. in plastic bottles, Fiji water. Anybody in here bought Fiji water? They love it. They want you to keep buying it. We need hurricane water. We need Palmetto water. We need to look at water as a resource. I told you about taking the 4 gigawatts of coal off. South Carolina has a huge natural resource. It just wasn't ready for development until recently. Utility scale solar now is being generated about a penny a megawatt. Natural gas about 2.3 cents. I had a client from Santa Monica call me the other day. They want to put in 7 gigawatts in South Carolina and wheel it up to the Northeast because it's so expensive what they're generating up there. So we're looking at how do we usher in a new era of energy. So where do the greenhouse gases come from? I'm going to go back to that for 1 minute. If you just simply think smokestacks and tailpipes, you're there. Okay? Industry, electricity, transportation, residential, commercial. Those are your broad areas. And once you get past industry, electricity, and transportation, you're up to 70%. So here in South Carolina, we've got a great opportunity. I hope that BMW and Volvo will be here next year. We have this talk. They are now rolling out an electric vehicle. We are now on the cusp of being a huge solar generation state. And look, I still represent energy companies. Don't confuse this with me drinking the Kool-Aid, okay? And I would tell you, the people that I talk to that say we're converting from coal to solar, they'll tell you that we're able to do it because it's much more economical. It's great for the environment, but we finally are at a place where these technologies are economically viable. There's a whole conversation about the life cycle costs, and you probably, was it Blackstone that came out last week and said all the money he controls about $1 trillion, we're going to have sustainability studies. So in South Carolina, we're looking at it at a 30,000 foot. We're going to reduce that 69 million metric tons. We will be the global leader in reduction. And now we're down here, how do we deal with a three-pronged challenge? We need to look for ways to deal with the reality of the situation. And these are some of the areas. I'm going to come to how we distilled the report in just a moment. Stabilization of marsh edges, consolidation of state resources. We're working to bring a huge joint operations center down here to Horry County at Coastal, because one of the things we have, and it's a real problem, is that we have water issues going through 4 state agencies. And I worked for over a year to find out where the federal money was coming. Like, we don't know. But nobody's ever dealt with this issue. I mentioned the whole 7,000 year thing, right? We're on the cusp of a very new emerging challenge. Grid protection through undergrounding to the extent possible. So we then broke this whole report down to 10 recommendations. Development of water channelization. I use that word just simply to poke them back. We need a reservoir in this state. I call these people, I said, you know, you are some of my most vociferous advocates for climate change. It's coming on us, and yet you're still using dogma from 20, 30 years ago. So what is channelization? I know there's developers in the room. This is what they think that is. You're going to pull a little bit of water off the Waccamaw and create a water feature in front of a gate. I'm like, guys, we got cities. It's a city underwater. Like, we have got to control that water. If we don't control the water is going to control us. So that's the truth on this. Am I getting close to the end? Because, man, I can do this all day. 15 minutes. Okay, good. I'm just getting to the good part. All right, so we then had to take 600 pages. We created, these are just bullets, and I'll email you the report. And then we had to come up with something that was manageable. And we said, one of the recommendations was to bring the public along, we're going to plant trees. And we were going to plant 1 million trees over 10 years, which I thought was reasonable. So I go into the mansion over the holidays, and I sit down with the governor, going through these 10 things. Oh, Tom, I like that planting trees. He said, you think you can plant 1 million trees this year? I said, sir, I said it 10 years. He said, good, we'll plant it this year. What day would you like to plant them on? I should have known better. So anyway, Earth Day, April 22nd, South Carolina will have the largest single-day tree planting in the history of the country. South Carolina. We'll be planting trees here. Why? Why are we planting trees? Because trees serve as a natural resiliency strategy. One tree retains 60 gallons of water annually. Okay? Over the life of the tree, it sinks 1 metric ton. So we will have a 1 million metric ton carbon sink going up in South Carolina on April 22nd this year. Our standard is not to be better than Brunswick. Our standard is not to look at Santa Monica and think, oh, you know, aren't they great out there? We will be a world leader in this, and we need Horry County leading that march. We need the best minds along the coast helping us with this. I told you each of our meetings we did something, and many of you were here when we kicked off our final meeting here in Horry County for our 4th quarter meeting. I never got to come back to tell you what we did. We collected 130 tons of debris from canals, ditches, and creeks on one day in Horry County. In Marion County, 2 months before that, we cleaned 2 miles of canals. So what is in that mess that we're dragging out of these waterways? What I want you to just close your eyes and think about that garage. Anything that you put in that garage is in that ditch. Paint thinners. I'm going to focus on a certain area that I personally pulled out. Paint thinners, paint, Drano. Okay, let me just stop there. Those products, if they came out of an industry, would have skull and crossbones on them, and they'd be being dealt with a manifest and being dealt with in a disposal regimen under our RCRA laws. When they come out of your garage and they go in that creek, that's just a shame. The Corps quit dredging in South Carolina, which they were here, love to challenge them, about 1980s. Since then, we don't have natural flowing of our water. Like optimally with North Carolina, as the water came out of the mountains and out of the water basin and lumber, it would roll through our canals, our creeks, and roll right out to the ocean. But we don't have that. Now, I told you there's no panacea, but we're beginning to open that up. And so what have we found in opening up these waterways? Found a couple things. One, when we open it up in Marion County, oh boy, Horry County is going to have it, right? Because now it's just rolling through Marion County and hitting Horry County, right? So you can't just pull out one piece. It's holistic. What did they say during the Revolutionary War? We're going to hang together, we're going to hang individually? We have to have a holistic solution, and none of it's easy. So when we open it up one place, we make it worse somewhere else. So we have to have the public conviction to do this together. Now some of this, after 45 minutes, may begin to seem boring, but I'll promise you this. If we don't solve this problem, our children, our grandchildren, they are going to deal with it. So we're either going to control our destiny or that destiny is going to control us. And so this is the challenge of this generation. We're going to continue to do this, and people are going to say, why aren't you in Columbia meeting, coming up with a plan? Okay? Because I told you, we have lunch bucket and we're going to work. Anybody want to be on the commission? Send me your name. You're on the commission. You just got deputized. Bring your lunch bucket. Okay, we as a state, as I told you, much of the science of how to deal with this has long been developed. Dr. Gaze, Dr. Lynn Petrovazia, the people that are dealing with these issues, brilliant, right here. We need to come together. These are going to be challenging issues, and I realize when we talk about real estate, I was there with Lucas versus Coastal Council. There's a whole body of law that I'm intimately familiar with that came out of South Carolina and takings and these things. So we have to, people say, because I've gone into places that I shouldn't have gone into. And I promise you, I'm not doing any more hazard weight. Bush asked, I was announced cancer-free last week after 2 surgeries last year, which I'm proud to tell you. I was supposed to start a new cleanup in the Amazon in Nigeria, and I called them. I said, you need to find somebody else, boys. I'm done with hazardous waste. I'm going to deal with water for a little while. We've got to deal with this issue. So people said, how do you bring people together? And this is a collaboration. So watch me. How do you bring people together? You don't. You lift them up. We have to find that place where our and it can be done. It can be done. Where our developers can thrive, where our economic investment can grow, and where we can protect the environment. I've spent a lot of years working with industry, showing them exactly how they can reduce their footprint and be more profitable. And as we create those formulas for success, we're going to see Horry County getting those newspaper headlines of being a global leader. And that is our real challenge. Our challenge is not to identify winners and losers. Our challenge is finding that higher ground. How do we do that? But we're no longer modeling, we're marking. Last year, I took a group up for National Geographic. And I wish I had the pictures. And we stopped the boat last year where the glacier was that year. And then we showed them where the glacier was this year, okay, which was about 100 feet in front of where we were. Now, why is that important? That's not modeling, that's marking. 2.7% of the water in the world is fresh water. The rest is salt water. So when we talk about water moving into our areas, it's development. Yes, when we're here, that's a major consideration. What did I tell you about what was in that ditch? And I didn't tell you this. From me to you was the start of a mobile home park. Those gases, those paint thinners, those Drano, all of that was going straight. There's no protection there, right? It's going straight into the aquifer. I'm coming over to my friend's house right here who's living in that mobile home. Where's he getting his water from? He's getting his water from the well out in these rural areas, right? So he's turning on his spigot, giving me a glass of water that's coming from the aquifer that right there is going into. Okay, so when we talk about these issues, we're not just talking about the dirt, we're also talking about broader issues. Where there have been problems around the world is where you'll begin to see, and we're talking about some of these issues today, is airborne pathogens. When we have more water, what do we have more opportunity for? Growth of mosquitoes and other things that are carrying these pathogens. So this is an issue that we simply have to begin to have an informed conversation. 30,000 foot conversation, we will take a leadership position. Leave that where it is, because this state, I'm telling you, we will have the largest single reduction in the world. At a local level, best I can tell you that we're doing now is triage, because next year it'll be a little different. But when you're on the battlefield and you have problems going on, you have to begin to deal with that. We've got to deal with it today, and we've got to lean forward. What is Horry County going to look like in 5 and 10 years and 20 years, given the best information? Not some esoteric modeling worst-case scenario, but what's out there now that we can look at. Google Kaktovik, Alaska. Google Fiji. Look at some of these island nations down in the Galápagos where I teach, where areas are under. How do we take the best information? Get outside of all the political noise. I don't do interviews with local reporters anymore because I don't want to be political gossip. It's too important. What's the best information we can to establish us as a global leader here in South Carolina? 1901, Withers Big Swamp. Okay, what's 3020 going to look like? What's 2050 going to look like? How do we become Burroughs and Collins? Because it wasn't easy for them. We take advantage of the table that was set by somebody else. We now have to meet our challenge. This is the challenge. This is what the challenge looks like. So I challenge each of you to please join us as we try to find a leadership position for our state and our local communities and protect those people who have investment and also have lives at stake. So thank you for allowing me to rant for a little while. It's great to see everybody.
Well, before you leave, I want to say thank you. I found your talk terrifying. Now I may not sleep. Thank you.